It's a great pleasure to share the podium tonight with Esther, and it's actually a great pleasure to speak at home for a change. And the University of Sydney in recent years has become my home, largely due to the work of the previous Vice-Chancellor, Gavin Brown, and Max Bennett in establishing something which some of you may not be familiar with down in the Camperdown, opposite Camperdown Park, the new Brain and Mind Research Institute. And it's grown very quickly over the last 5 years to be one of the largest institutes actually in this university and one of the few multidisciplinary and interfaculty entities, really emphasising that to deal with the issues that are at stake in health and disease in this area, one can no longer work in single, isolated entities of science or of health policy or the wider world to have any significant understanding. And we've been able to move into that space as a consequence of some forward-thinking people in this university. And I'd like in that context to add a little Australian flavour to some of the issues that Esther has raised, as well to focus on some of the issues related specifically to disease. In doing so, there's a very important and famous Chinese icon that was actually in Science, or reproduced in Science in January 2006, in an article about the health effects related to depression. But it particularly took my focus because Chinese physicians of many centuries ago didn't immediately leap into your head to try and find where depression was coming from. In fact, they leapt into your chest, because what people described and what people understood at the time is that they were not sick in the sort of 19th and 20th century Western tradition of being sick in your head. They were sick everywhere, and they felt that illness of depression most actually in their chest as being unwell. And there's a lot of interest at that time as to whether the cause of the problem actually lay in the chest in some way or other. It's an interesting kind of idea, because I think one of the problems that we've struggled with in the areas that Esther and myself have worked in, of trying to look at these connections between brain functioning and psychological state and health, is that we don't experience our brain in life quite the same way as we experience breathlessness or chest pain or a swollen joint that Esther was talking about. And we don't experience the stress response or the acute stress response you may recognise, but maladies otherwise that are affecting you don't feel in quite the same way when they're affecting brain function. We don't have the same kind of physiological experience, but we do have the experience of being sick in other parts of the body as a consequence of that. We've had this kind of problem of studying the brain for many years. That is, we had great trouble studying it in life. We had to wait till you died and get it out and chop it up and see what it was actually doing. As Esther was just showing at the end of the talk, as we can do with modern technologies now, with PET scanning and MRI scanning, we can actually look at the brain in life and look at its changes in life during different physiological states. And even if we don't kind of experience it like the heart or the lungs, we can actually see it responding in various sets of ways. As Esther was saying at the start of that PBS production, you know, the paradigm of modern traditional medicine has been if you can't see it, it's not real. Well, actually, post about 1990, we can now see it in life in the brain. We don't have to chop it out and put it in a bottle. The other problem with that approach to neurosciences, which have dominated a lot of the last 100 years, was of studying a brain in a bottle, not a brain in a person, and not a person talking to another person or a person existing in a social group, and to tend to see its connections and its chemistry as something quite in isolation from the. Most of this work in neuroimmunology and neuroendocrine work over recent years has really emphasised the extent of, in one sense, what Esther was emphasising in her talk this afternoon, the bleeding obvious we've known for over 70 years of the way the brain causes the hypothalamic pituitary axis to go off, which causes the adrenal gland to go off to release cortisone, the very straightforward nature of what Esther was just showing of the way in which the brain regulates those other key systems. Or as I show shortly, not so clear until more recent years, the way it regulates the immune system. Of even more importance, I'd argue, is the way in which understanding disturbances in those systems and actually natural response in the systems actually feed back, that this is a two-way system, that this is a loop. It's not just your response to stress affecting those systems, but the extent to which disturbances in those systems themselves feed back and affect brain function. So the extent to which psychological illnesses, which may arise in the brain or be mediated by the brain, cause physical illness, but also the extent to which physical illness itself and changes in these systems may cause perturbed brain function, which will include your cognitive and emotional states. You know, you can get sick in the head from being sick in the body as much as being sick in the body leads the other way around. Some of the famous kind of sets of studies in this area, in fact, done in Sydney, and I must say that previously done at the university I used to be part of many years ago, the University of New South Wales, the names that people will recognise around here, people like Ron Penny, who's been at the heart of much of immunology in Australia at St Vincent's, and Leslie Kylway, the previous Professor of Psychiatry at the University of New South Wales, supervised a relatively young Roger Bartrop at that stage to look at actually lymphocyte function following bereavement in a very famous paper published in The Lancet in the early 1970s. in looking at T cell function, particularly in men following the death of their spouse. Now, the T cell is particularly important, and this work was important at two levels. A very clear demonstration that in real life, not just in the lab, that a particular psychological state that we'd all recognise, bereavement, which is one of these chronically ongoing states of distress, is actually associated in change in a key body regulatory system, the immune system, but specifically T cells within the immune system. Now, T cells really regulate the cell-mediated response, the things that are immune surveillance in the body, and really play out against viral infection and surveillance against cancer. So they're the things that are sitting there constantly keeping you well. If you think you get rid of a viral illness, you don't actually get rid of it. The virus just goes quiet and can come back, as is often the case. For example, with many herpes infections, you get reactivation. Or in the cancer surveillance area, we all produce cancer cells all the time. That's not really the problem. The problem is actually turning them off and wiping them out. And if in the sense that if T cells were affected, then you would be more likely to get things like viral infections or cancers in the long run. Or as Esther's pointed out, I think more recently, to suggest that cancer progression may go ahead. We got more interested in the 1990s in work I was doing at the University of New South Wales in the extent to which these real-life in vivo immune responses, not just immune responses in the lab, but actually cell-mediated immune responses, same things that are T-cell-dependent responses, were impaired in patients with severe depression. So not just in ordinary psychological states, but if you developed one of these significant psychological illnesses like severe depression or melancholia, the extent to which your T-cell system, your cell-mediated system, the thing that might really matter in terms of illness, may be affected. In other areas of health, we've been interested in not only the effects on the immune system, but back through the sympathetic nervous system and others, what might be the issues related to other common diseases like coronary artery disease. And this is a particular paper with the Heart Foundation and association with Beyond Blue really emphasised the extent to which we need to take account of not just what the immune system might be doing, but other outputs associated with abnormal states. And in this particular area, stress is in inverted commas because what the Heart Foundation emphasised, again, picking up from Esther's talks, the importance of chronic illnesses. There were certain acute factors that are associated with acute myocardial infarction, but much, much more commonly, states of depression or social isolation were actually strong risk factors for the development of coronary artery disease and preceded the coronary artery disease. They weren't simply a reaction to coronary artery disease, as these were typically diseases of younger people who went on to develop coronary artery disease. You know, in this university, we're about to get totally preoccupied with a new institute devoted to diabetes and being overweight on an ongoing basis. And just think about that as something as a lifestyle set of issues, but often fail to recognise the extent to which other prior psychological symptoms like depressive symptoms and metabolic syndromes are actually more likely in those who've actually had depressive symptoms. So a lot of the patient education material we use in the depression world, we talk about the importance of treatments. We talk about a lot about the medical effects of untreated depressive disorders and the way that is played out through those various body systems, resulting in physical ill health, in addition to the lifestyle sets of other issues that tend to run. So in a lot of patient-based situations, we need to provide further information about how that is playing out in taking ill health further. On the other side of the coin, I've spent a long time with my colleague Andrew Lloyd and others, Dennis Wakefield at the University of New South Wales, asking the question the other way around. If the immune system produces its inflammatory products, its signalling systems, the cytokines, the extent to which they drive the onset of neuropsychiatric syndromes. So not just when you've got a neuropsychiatric syndrome do you get sick by these mechanisms, what happens if you get an infection or the inflammatory system starts to play its own games? Will you develop actually depression or another psychiatric set of illnesses? And some of the work we've done over long periods of time, we've followed people with infective illnesses, particularly into post-infective and chronic fatigue syndromes. This is an article from the British Medical Journal from 2006 of our long-term studies in that area, showing clear associations between viral infections and, in fact, long-term ill health in key populations. Now, Esther's shown you her particular diagram about the factors. I guess the summary kind of issue here is for a long time people thought about just very simple relationships between the central nervous system driving aspects of the immune system. What Esther has shown in her work and many others is the very complicated nature and the very complicated bidirectional nature, and that there are many systems actually playing constantly between the central nervous system and particularly the immune system, which can be triggered from either side. So you can end up with various sets of immune-related disorders that drive depression, drive cognitive impairment, drive fatigue states, or you can have a range of central nervous system-related disorders that may themselves be driving abnormal immune and other factors. When you start to think about what are the health challenges of the future, In Australia at the moment, we're in permanent election campaign. We're having trouble thinking beyond tomorrow as to what decisions we might make. In other countries where they take a little longer between elections and decide things, like in the UK, actually people stepped back for a little while and said, what is really going to matter to the health of countries in the future, in the developed world? Once you've got over the problems of infection and childhood diseases, what is really going to matter? And the UK government, often for science, it's not for health, it's not for education, for science, said basically the most important thing is actually not going to be our mental health, it's going to be our mental wealth. It's going to be the capacity to use our cognitive and emotional resources to survive. That these are the big issues, not just in health, but actually in socioeconomics and in health policy or economic policy for the future. At the brain science level, we know that, in a sense, using Norman Doidge's kind of a popularisation of the terms of neuroplasticity, the changing nature of this particular organ. It is not a brain in a bottle, it's a thing that's constantly reacting to many of the situations that we see, including those related to illness or toxic exposures. I'm glad to see the Law Society has a large bar now outside the new law building. I'm not sure whether it's to match the size of the bars further down the university, but we still seem to have a preoccupation in Australia to see whether we can expose ourselves to the maximum number of toxic agents during our developmental years as a piece of cultural pride. Not so good from a brain point of view. There are other things, I'm glad to say, though. I'm glad to see my father's in this audience who graduated from the medical humanities course at age 81. He's older than that now and he's still here, just to show us up a bit. You know, that staying in employment, I'm sure, has kept him out of a nursing home and reduced costs to the rest of the family over a long period of time. Fortunately, in the university now, we don't have to retire, a marvellous thing. Because when we know about what we should do to stay well from a brain point of view and a body point of view together, education and employment really matter. I've never been too enthusiastic myself personally, I'm happy to recommend them to others, about the bottom two, about dietary restriction and exercise. But it's kind of interesting that the things that drive, we would associate driving physical health, also drive brain health on an ongoing basis in a responsive brain that's highly responsive to its environment. A little while ago, I had to do a talk about so-called nutraceuticals, stuff you can buy to boost your immune system or boost your health and whatever. And if you took these things, which you could order on the web, you'd look like this. What was clear was if you behaved like this, you wouldn't need to take the nutraceuticals. If you got outside, if you exercised, if you did things in pairs, if you interacted with animals, if you exercised, etc., you did things in generations, from a brain point of view and a body point of view, what's good for your brain, what's good for your body, the same kind of sets of things. And again, exercise and physical health really matters. In our own institute these days in the developing brain area, we're increasingly interested in the interactions with circadian patterns and with sleep patterns and the extent to which they are disrupted, particularly in young people in our society. Within the so-called dietary world, which things really matter, and the ones that we are particularly interested in relate to fish oils and to folate. To things that matter in the social world. I'm at least glad to see the law students out there socialising, that at least the issue of social attachment is something happening out there, while other things that may not be so good are also happening. But also treating clear states are associated with ill health, and this issue about whether actually promoting more positive emotional states may actually have health benefits as well. And the need to do that, this is from the Mental Wealth of Nations, right across the life course. There are critical periods. We tend to think about pregnancy and early childhood as being critical, but they're just one of the critical periods. There are critical periods right across the life cycle that really matter in terms of maximising this approach to health. From the developing brain point of view, it does matter what happens in childhood, and the extent to which environments are enhanced for these activities matter to this overall set of health. And then this need not only to provide the obvious, but also to support serious public policies that reduce risk. One of the issues from Esther's other work, if you look into it, is not just about the stress response, but developing very abnormal patterns of stress response if you're a child who's exposed to things like childhood sexual abuse or other trauma that change your stress response for life and then have adverse effects on health on an ongoing basis. And they're really serious sets of interactions. So these systems that we've been talking about can themselves be made permanently abnormal by certain kinds of environmental experiences, beyond the obvious ones like alcohol killing them, by actually other psychological ones, childhood sexual abuse being perhaps the most investigated. And the extent to which these systems themselves actually, little typo here, actually develop across the adolescent period. We've been talking in an adult way as if they're all grown up and that's how you were born with them. But they're actually systems that depend on the brain itself developing through this period. And I love to show this to you in universities and other places, usually in high schools. You don't have a fully developed brain until you're quite into this later period. So the 17 and 18-year-olds who are out there, hopefully not 17-year-olds, the 18-year-olds and others who are out there currently drinking a lot of alcohol are actually not necessarily got to the end, and particularly the males, the end of their developmental period. Now, developing frontal lobes matters to not only having great brains for universities, but the brain itself is then regulating all of these other systems, the circadian system, the immune system, the neuroendocrine system, and they're not at the end of necessarily their developmental phases. So you've got a developing brain also with its regulatory systems, particularly the circadian system and immune systems. So for the adolescent and early adult brain, this becomes even more important. You do the obvious, and we try to do more and more of this through our systems, but they themselves are then interacting with those other systems, those brain-dependent systems through those periods. So we've got to give a lot of serious thought to what is really going on, not just from a brain-body point of view, but at critical periods of development. But we do tend to have a very childlike notion of development as if it's all happened in utero or in the first few years, and it isn't continuing to really go on in the environments that we're talking about. And so from a brain disease point of view, there are two great periods that matter in changing brains. One is of development, and if it goes astray, you're in big trouble. So 60% of the disability, health-related disability we see in Australia in 15 to 34-year-olds is due to mental health and substance abuse-related problems. These are problems of the developing brain. The other is that related to later life, the degenerative sets of problems. Fortunately, this particular degree, 50% of disability in those over the age of 75 being due to brain-related disorders, is actually falling and moving further to your right as we watch it, due to better public health, in fact, in the middle years. But you can see if you run into brain-related problems, these are also the areas in which you may run into the problems associated with therefore dysregulation of your circadian system or your immune system or your endocrine system or all those other dependent systems. So, what's happened really over the last 40 years, which has been so exciting, is to see not just a sort of lump of brain in a bottle, but to see a highly interactive system that we can now study of the interactions between the brain and the immune, neuroendocrine, circadian systems. And it's bidirectional. Or, better said, it's just the one system. It's only a Western medicine kind of idea that made the brain and the body separate in the first place, as if the brain was in a bottle in some other place that was not the body on an ongoing basis. And that's a really odd idea, and in fact not a cultural idea that's shared by many other cultures on an ongoing basis, whereas a one organism that is in interaction constantly with its environment and many other organisms on its ongoing basis. And that's what contributes to its overall homeostasis. We've come to, in a mechanistic way, which is our way of approaching the sciences of these areas, to have a much better idea about that. So that now we have a much better idea of the physical health effects of psychological disorder. What goes wrong in depression isn't just all in your head or all in your brain. You end up back with the Chinese wanting to dive into people's chests to really understand the full experience of being depressed. And it's surprising the extent to which that has got lost in our own society. When we see people all the time who say, I can't be depressed, I just feel awful. I feel so sick. And I go, no, you are sick. They go, no, I only think I'm sick. And I go, no, you are sick. They go, no, you don't get it. Because I know what my own story is as to how I got sick. That we've replaced the physiology with the narrative. And the post-20th century, the post-Freudian world, we love our own narrative. It is the explanation of my illness, of what has happened to me. The only trouble is the narrative's got disconnected from the physiology. And so people fail to understand their own experience of being well, or in fact of recovery from being well in many sets of situations. We've almost totally discounted the mental health effects of physical ill health, of when you get unwell with cancer or you get unwell with infection, that you feel very unwell. You often feel moody, often you can't concentrate. And a lot of other work are associated, I haven't described tonight, in terms of the effects of cancer treatments, of radiotherapy and of chemotherapy, contributing to fatigue, contributing to mood change on an ongoing basis. People go, it must be a reaction to having cancer. Because it's not just a psychological reaction, it's the physiology of the whole system has changed as a consequence of the cancer treatment, creating great trouble for many people who've been treated for cancer on an ongoing basis or have a post-infective syndrome on an ongoing basis. And the mental health effects of physical health, mental health benefits of physical health are now much better understood. And so the challenge for us becomes collectively, how do we take all of this new knowledge and therefore incorporate it into not just health understandings, health care understandings, but into the wider world in which we live. Thanks.